I definitely did unleash the wrath of the internet, and it was totally innocent, by the way. I totally, I I wrote a little bit about this on my Substack, but I went on my long run on Sunday mornings before mass, and I'm sitting, kind of cooling off because it was a hot, humid day, and I had an image of like a grown man at a restaurant with his wife or girlfriend, and his wife and his girlfriend, or his wife, his partner was decked out, looked really lovely, had a dress on, and was done up, and he's there, and he's sitting in whatever jeans and a t-shirt and a baseball cap. Like this image just flooded into my head, and I just thought to myself, I don't like that. I don't think that that's good. I think a grown man should be a grown man and like bring a little dignity to the proceedings. But so I just dashed this thing out, went, took a shower, went about my day, and came back, and holy smokes, that thing just absolutely blew up. So I was not setting out to be a Twitter ex grifter, but man, it's fantastic. I'm so glad I did it.
It was your taste of infamy.
I know. And it does a weird thing to you. It really does. When, I have a couple of thousand followers on Twitter, and I'm pretty active. I enjoy Twitter. I'm one of those weird guys. Like I really just like it. It's a lot of fun for me to banter and play around verbally. It reminds me in some ways of being a student again. Rather than being the one responsible for sort of the main narrative, I can kind of joke and quip on the side. But man, having millions of people look at something you dashed off with your thumbs on your phone was a very surreal experience, I have to say. So at any rate, so Ellen, I am super excited to be back with you. I have to point out to our audience, you and I sat down. You were gracious enough to sit down with me about 2 weeks ago, maybe a week and a half. No, I think it was exactly 2 weeks ago. And we had a really great conversation. And for whatever reason, it's a poor carpenter that blames his tools, but I realized that I botched the recording. So we only have a half of it. And so you were like, hey, Kale, just let me know when it's coming out. And I'm like desperately on my hard drive looking for like, where is this thing? And of course, it's not there. And so you were like, well, and of course, I felt like a total amateur and a noob. And you have got like a business and you have employees and all this kind of thing. And so I felt really terrible about wasting your time. And you were cool. You're like, hey, let's just do it again. I had a good time the first time. So thank you, Ellen. Thank you for coming back and trying to do this again. I can see the little record button right now. So the record button is on. It is recording. And so welcome back to the Underneath.
Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here again. I had such a great time. And the challenge is to make this one even better somehow than that other one, which was great.
Yeah. So I have a comparison. So, I as you know, I'm a teacher, and oftentimes when you teach 2 or 3 sections of the same course, right? So let's say I'm teaching American history, American lit, and we're reading The Great Gatsby. And so on several of the days, you're going to have that multiple times that day. And so sometimes you walk in, first period, and you just hit it out of the ballpark. It's, you're just firing on all cylinders. Great things pop up. It's happening. And so then, you're like, oh, very excited because you had a good class. And then the second class, you're kind of wanting to recreate that. And you're sort of trying to find the words to redo it. And so it doesn't always go so well. So I'm going to do my best not to be haunted by the great conversation and just dive right in. So first things first, Ellen, could you just tell my audience who you are? Like what goes on in your day-to-day life? What do you do?
Yeah, absolutely. I am the founder of a writing and publishing business. And we started out as a writing coaching business exclusively, just with that, basically with a value proposition as simple as that. Just, hey, we're offering writing coaching. And we have since then, over the last 4 years or so, built upwards into being a full-fledged publishing company. So we're also putting out little independent books and working with authors who want to publish something outside of the legacy system for a bunch of reasons, which I imagine we'll get into.
I would, yeah, very much. So I love that. I love your idea that there is a portion, it may be the most important portion of the market, so to speak, that is being underserved by this mega market, right? This sort of these mega publishers, and we're going to get into that for a second. So, just so the audience knows, I ran into Ellen as I run into a lot of folks on Twitter, but really first it was on a podcast, and in this podcast, you were talking. I'm interested in publishing just in general, and I'm interested just the phenomena of publishing, and I have my own sort of critique on big pub, right? But you were coming at it from a slightly different angle, and on this podcast, the podcast host, I believe, is Farrell, right? He asked you some questions, and you had some like important things that were sort of part of your, I don't know, your arsenal or your toolkit. Your I think you called them Bibles for the things that sort of fuel you and generate you. And you talked about the sonnets, and as a fellow fan of Shakespeare's sonnets, I was like, oh, that's intriguing. I like that. And you seem to understand that the sonnets were not just the sonnets, and maybe we can get into that. But then you also brought up that an influential book for you was Peter Thiel's 0 to 1. And I have this sort of other side of me that I kind of like reading business books, even though I consider myself not very business savvy or anything like that. Full disclosure, I've been a W-2 employee for like 28 years or whatever it is. Like I marvel at this whole thing, but I like reading these books, and I think that book in particular is really good. So how can you see Shakespeare's sonnet sequence and Peter Thiel's 0 to 1 as sort of these two seemingly disparate things that fuel you and your vision and your work?
Yes. So it's funny. A lot of people have made that observation because a lot of the reputation that I have is for being really good with business writing. My team and I have worked on some of these business books that are like pretty acclaimed now with Shane Parrish and Mike Maples and some of these people. And people come to me for advice on business writing specifically. And startup founders have benefited so much from my advice on their business writing that they've not only paid me well in cash, but also given me equity in their startups and all this stuff. So I have this whole professional reputation as like being this business writing person who helps people with all these business writing projects. And people are like floored that I'm the author of a poetry book and that I am a huge fan of poetry and a student of Shakespeare and like a devotee of Shakespeare and a huge fan of poetry in general. And what I tell people is these things are not as far apart as they initially seem. So like on the craft side, a lot of why I'm able to give some of the advice that I can give, like on one hand, I have a fascination with business and markets, and I majored in economics and math and learned all that stuff. And I apply some of that knowledge and am myself an unemployable person who has this kind of entrepreneurial trajectory in life. And so I'm able to sort of understand like business communications. But the reason I'm able to help people execute so well is that I've studied language on that very granular level that comes from being a student of poetry. And in particular, Shakespeare really inspires me for a bunch of reasons, but one of them is that he was a great entrepreneur in his own day. And a lot of people don't know that he was a co-founder of the Globe Theater, that he and his crew, the Lord Chamberlain's men, came together and they were like, oh, hey, we have this Shakespeare IP. We own the right to all these Shakespeare plays. So he keeps writing them and they're just like really good. So they're
pretty good. I mean, who would have thought,
It's like pretty solid. So we have a monopoly on this stuff and we can build our own theater and we can be the only theater throughout, the world that technically has the right to put on Shakespeare's plays. And so we're going to go ahead and make a nice little business doing that. And that's exactly what they did. And Shakespeare was able to retire to the countryside thanks to his ownership stake in the Globe Theater. So he himself was both an artist and a businessman. And there's something about that I like hugely aspire to and respect and admire. So those are some of the threads that come together into that.
Yeah. Is there something specifically about the sonnet that sings to you?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. So we did talk about this. It was Jim O'Shaughnessy, I think, who was interviewing me on the Infinite Loops podcast, and we talked a little bit about it there. And yeah, here's what it is. It's the constraint of the sonnet form. So what I learned from Shakespeare's sonnets, if you actually study the sonnets on the level that I've studied them, where you read the sonnets a bunch of times and you see this guy getting like putting in 154 reps
Yeah.
of dealing with this constraint of trying to express something within this very constrained the strict sort of set of rules, and creating things that are so transcendent inside of that constraint. And then you realize, you start to see these turns of phrase inside of the sonnets that come up like 10 years later in like King Lear,
Yeah.
which which to me is fantastic. And so Shakespeare actually, he will, there's like a line, love is not love, that shows up in the sonnets, and then it comes up, I believe, in King Lear. And there's a bunch of other examples along those lines where Shakespeare, if you look at the timeline of when he wrote the sonnets and when he wrote some of his really, really great majestic tragedies and the great plays, the sonnets were earlier. They were the proving ground and the whetstone, and which, pick your metaphor, in
Yeah.
terms of how he was actually learning how to write and learning how to deal with the constraints of this kind of creative pursuit. And so when I read the sonnets, I see somebody who is putting in the reps.
Right. Right.
Just on a fundamental level. And so I always, I always go back there and I compare it a lot of times to the whole Twitter thing. Speaking of Twitter,
Yeah.
I compare it a lot of times to the Twitter thing, because there are a lot of really talented writers who have kind of got started writing on Twitter, especially back when the character constraint was only 140 and then
140.
280. And they started to, and it's a little bit different in certain ways, because the sonnet, it's a different kind of constraint and it has different parameters. But the fact that people had to make decisions, that you couldn't just put anything in a tweet, because you literally can't.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so having to make those decisions, and then people realized, oh wow, I'm using 8 words to say something that I could use 2 words to say, and it forced them to realize that. And that's a great thing for becoming better at clarity and concision and all that stuff. So that's kind of what I compare it to in terms of a modern analog.
Yeah, the spirit of constraint is, perhaps strikes people in the audience's ears as being a little bit counterintuitive. That what do you mean? The constraint of the sonnet is the fuel for creativity. But if you've ever attempted to do a sequence of sonnets, 14 lines, 10-syllable line, a couplet at the end, you can break it up in a couple of three, whatever, a few different ways. How can that possibly, be an avenue for creativity? And I think that, when you do study those things, I think it was Robert Frost who said, I love Frost. He was such a crank. But he would say something along the lines of like, writing free verse is like trying to play tennis without a net. And I think there's a real truth to that you can kind of wrap your head around the paradox that the constraint of the net, sticking with tennis here for a second, the constraint of the net and the lines of the court afford, or open up a space for excellence, which is otherwise not there. And so I think similarly, the sonnet um, forces you to solve problems that you might not find it necessary to solve if there are no constraints, there are no rules. And I think the overlap for me, as I hear you talking about it, is that Shakespeare the poet and Shakespeare the businessman are not two people. There's a kind of singularity there, isn't there?
Sure. Totally. I mean, so I love everything you said about constraints. I think it's totally true. And I think there's a lot of, there's the right amount of constraint that leads to creativity. And it's somewhere in between you know, like people say that necessity is the mother of invention. And I think that is true to some degree, but I think that some amount there's sort of the right amount of constraint that leads to kind of the most creative behavior, and there are certain constraints that are sort of better than others and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, it's Stephen Fry actually has this book called The Ode Less Traveled,
I have it.
which I
Yeah,
know
I
you
have
might
it.
not be Stephen Fry's biggest fan, but that book, and he talks about it at the beginning because um he talks about how people have kind of arrived. Yeah, it's a great book. He talks about how people have sort of arrived. I might have it behind me too.
It's
But
fantastic. It's a great book. It's a great
he,
book.
he talks about how people have arrived at this place where poetry just has no rules, and that
Yeah,
makes it boring and extremely bland. And I'm not going to name them because I don't want to be like that. But
yeah,
there's a pretty well respected poetry publication that sends out these poems and these chapbooks and stuff like that. And I was reading a couple of lines from what they most recently sent me, and it was indistinguishable from the kind of mumbo jumbo that somebody who works at like a major consulting for like a big 15,000 employee consulting firm would
yeah,
write. Like
yeah.
it's just fully just
Oh,
abstractions, and it's like our apartness and our togetherness are both entities, and it's like, dude,
mm,
I like people have paid me good money to teach them how to not be
yeah,
abstract and opaque and obscure and like using all these abstract phrases as a noun and like
yeah,
saying things like the leveraging of the, all this kind of stuff. I'm like, people have to train themselves out of this to become clear communicators in the world of trade and commerce, where you will stop getting paid if people don't understand what the heck you're saying.
yeah,
and like it drives me nuts when I see that people have just decided in poetry and in literature in general that like, oh, we don't need to have any rules, or the only rules that apply are these sort of like weird, like status seeking
yeah,
rules around
yeah,
what sort of sounds a little bit like Faulkner may have sounded if he was
yeah, yeah,
on mushrooms or something. I don't know. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
it's like that stuff just sets me off, and it's a big part of why I started a publishing company.
Well, I want to get into that because that's something I really I want to get into this. So before I got us going here on the podcast, I decided, you know what, let me go see what Grok says about Ellen Fishbein, right? And so this is
I love
so
this.
yeah, so we're just going to try this out, right? Because I do have a connection. You were talking about the sort of the bloated, crappy language of a poetry. I think a real threat to make that even worse is AI. But anyway, we're going to give Grok a chance here. It says, um, before founding Altamira Studio, Ellen Fishbein was involved in various writing-related ventures. She built a B2B writing agency while she was a student and later contributed to growing a B2C media startup to reach 30 million readers. This background underscores her expertise in writing, editing, and content strategy, which she leverages at Altamira. That's pretty good. This publishing company is unique for its emphasis on concise, impactful content, aiming to deliver books that are both meaningful and timely. Altamira focuses on short form books, typically between 15,000 and 20,000 words, challenging the traditional publishing model's often bloated word counts. The studio prides itself on rapid publication, taking only 2 to 3 months from manuscript to print, which is significantly faster than traditional publishers. And audience, let me tell you, that is significantly faster. But I love this line, and I forget. She was described by David Perel as like Rick Rubin for writing. So anybody who's compared to Rick Rubin is automatically ascends my hierarchy of value because I think the world of Rick Rubin. So you've got this reputation, Ellen. Grok picked it up, and it's pretty good. There's more here. I won't bore the audience with it, but I thought that was pretty good. So I'm scared to put me in there. We'll see what happens later on. It'll probably involve stupid baseball caps, but at any rate,
Kale Zelden lives in infamy
yes,
ever since his.
that's right. Yeah, yeah. So Altamira comes out of a perceived problem. Can you tell us a little bit about the problem that you saw and why on God's green earth would you want to take on Penguin? etc., etc.
Yeah. First of all, yeah, that grok thing was pretty good.
Yeah,
Except why use the word leverage when you could just use the word use? I don't know.
yeah.
But
Well, leverage is a fancy. Hey, that's like a $3 word, So
but yeah, I so there's sort of the reader side and the writer side, and
Mhm.
kind of both of those exist for me. But it really started with being a reader. Like
Mhm.
when I was growing up, books were everything to me. They were my
Mhm.
favorite thing. They really inspired me to get creative and to find sanity in the world and all this kind of stuff. Like ever since I was really young, I was extremely into books and reading and all that stuff. And it was huge for me. It was like what my life was all about. And there was at some like 20-ish years passed. And then I found somehow that I had lost my love of reading. I
Weird.
didn't really know
Hmm.
how that happened to be the case. At some point, I sort of realized, wow, I've been reading these articles and I've been reading these blog posts and I've been rereading books that I really liked when I was younger. And,
Mhm.
I've been rereading George Orwell or whatever. But
Yep.
I walk into bookstores, I walk into libraries, I walk into all these places, and I never find anything new that's been coming out over the
Mhm.
last decade or so
Sure.
that I think is good. And I can make a lot of snap judgments about a book by picking it up, just like any reader can. And I can look at a lot of things about it, including the length and the subject matter, and just the first few paragraphs of the introduction or the first chapter, even the typesetting and the paper quality, all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, especially bookstores, I'm like walking in and walking out empty handed. And this just kept happening, and it happened with the genres that I loved the most, like poetry and, not a lot of nonfiction stuff, and even business books. I actually really like business books a lot
Yeah.
of times, and I wasn't fine. So, I was like, "What is going on here?" And so, for years, I just beat myself up for this. I was like, "Well, Ellen, you have succumbed to the technocratic dystopian age
Yeah.
in which you
Yeah.
live. At that time, I was working for a consumer media startup, which was very much like ship these blog posts and all that kind of stuff. And like, Ellen, well, you're just a product of growing up in this time, and you've lost your attention span." And I basically like gave myself shit about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then eventually I started this writing coaching thing, and I started getting involved with a lot of people who are themselves good people, who are involved in the publishing industry, the authors themselves, the publishers, the editors, even agents are are good people by and large. All these people are they're good people by and large. But they're functioning within an institute. Like I actually, it's like walking into the factory. The sort of metaphor is like walking into the factory where the sausages are made and all that
Yeah.
stuff, right? I'm like, oh, okay. Now I see. And it wasn't even just like, it wasn't so much that I was grossed out by what was going into the sausages. It was more like, oh, every single machine in here is broken.
Mm.
Every single process in here is totally screwed up. They're like taking 15 steps to do something that should take 2. Um, and so I saw this whole machine that actually brings these books, and that includes Amazon, which is actually my biggest, in a way, my biggest, if I have an adversary, it's
Yeah.
probably in certain ways, in certain ways, Amazon. But I saw all these things that come together to bring these books into our Amazon carts and onto our shelves. And I was like, "Oh, this industry is not able to produce stuff that takes a risk and that is really, really creative and that's interesting." And instead, they're tending toward all this risk aversion and packing the books with fluff and optimizing for kind of people buying the books in order to display them and not in order to like really read and enjoy them, and all this kind of litany
Wait.
of
So so y-
problems.
so you're suggesting that a book publishing outfit is not so much concerned about reading as such, but sales.
Well, certainly, yeah, and it makes a lot of sense that they are, because the way that the publishing companies are I mean, most of the Simon& and Schuster, Penguin Random House, most of these publishing companies, and by the way, Warner Brothers is also as old as these companies, which is
Yeah,
kind of
well,
interesting. They're 100 years old.
right, and as you know, I wanna get into this because what
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
describing, I worked and lived in Hollywood, in between teaching gigs, and you could say almost the exact same thing here for that media, ecosystem.
Mhm. Yep. I mean, the institutional decay, right? And and it's sort of a natural thing that happens, like, a company starts and it's small, like Simon& and Schuster. Do you know the founding story of Simon& and Schuster?
I don't, but give it to me because it sounds like it's
It's
good.
a
Come on.
cool story. So
All
these
right.
these these guys, they pooled some money that they managed to find, but the reason was that it was either, I think it was Simon,
Uh,
the Simon of
yeah, the
Simon& and
Simon part of
Schuster.
Simon& and Schuster, yeah.
He had an aunt who was like a crazy devotee of the New York Times crossword puzzle.
Okay.
And so she was like, "Ah," she's like, "I wish I could just buy a book of crossword puzzles so I didn't have to wait every week for the New York Times crossword puzzle." And, like, Simon, the little enterprising young man,
Yeah,
he's like, "Hmm, what if you could?"
yeah,
And so they put this thing together. They raised these funds together, and this was 100 years ago. This was literally in, like, the 1920s.
yeah.
They raised these funds, and the first things that they published were crossword puzzle collections, because they had identified that there was a market for that, there was interest in that, and they had this whole model around planned publishing where they knew basically what the idea was, and they would kind of recruit a team to put this together and to execute it. And that was how they started. And it's like we're so far away from that now. Like, obviously the founders are long gone. The institution has grown to encompass so many different things, and there are advantages that come with size and all these things, but there are
Sure.
also things that get, um, kind of attached to that institution over time, and it just becomes this lumbering thing that is destroying as much as it may be destroying more than it's creating now. Um,
So the
anyway,
you know,
yeah.
no, no, this is great. Because what I love about this, one of the things that I like to talk about on this podcast are patterns, right? And we see these patterns that replicate themselves out, and they're not exact duplicates, but they're like fractals, right? You can sort of see versions of them up and down, these various hierarchies. And when you talk about the publishing system, and you can talk about big media, you can talk about big pharma, you can talk about big auto, you can talk about all of these massive, multifaceted institutions that are designed, or at least were inspired originally to solve a problem. And so you're talking about with Simon and Schuster is like he had an aunt who wanted a collection of them, and she right away he said, I can solve that problem, and I can swoop in here with kind of nimbleness and alacrity, and I can really make something happen, right? And so I like to think of these large institutions as bodies. And the body of big publishing that you're talking about, the word that kept flooding into my head as I hear you talk is the word sclerotic, or sclerosis, which is, when parts of your body or an organ system or a vein becomes rigid and unresponsive, and it's no longer able to do the thing that it was able to do. It can no longer adapt because it's become rigid and almost ossified. And so um, why do you think the book is this a necessary thing that happens to a body over time? And I'm using, of course, body here to talk about a Simon and Schuster or a Penguin or what have you.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think companies are a lot like living organisms,
Mhm.
in that they are born and they grow up and they reach maturity and they reach old age.
Yeah.
And in kind of the business world, there's this sort of people are always sort of tracking like the life cycles of different companies, and and certain companies are able to be around for a very long time, and certain institutions like universities even are able to be around for much longer than any corporation. Um,
But I mean, is
But
is
they
there a
suffer
way in
from
which
a
we
lot
can
of
see
these
that
same
universities have become zombied versions of themselves,
they
perhaps?
suffer from a lot of these same problems. Like my co-founder at Altamira, Bill Jaworski, is a former professor, and he
Yeah,
talks all the time about how um, something, or it was either Yale or one of these institutions, like their endowment is so large that they could just use the interest on
yeah,
essentially the annual interest on their endowment to fund a free education for like all their students.
yeah,
So
correct.
why are they still charging
Yeah.
tuition?
Right. Right. Absolutely. And there's a what is, the joke, that these are sort of large trust funds that have a sort of a side gig with a school, right? That, and of course they enjoy all kinds of nonprofit status, which can, build it, right? So there's something sort of decadent about the thing, that in big publishing, this kind of decadence that you're talking about, that we can see in a variety of different institutions. um, what then happens to the thing? What happens to the problem solving thing that people at least originally wanted?
Yeah, so there are a couple of good examples. So I'll pick on the legacy publishers
Yeah,
themselves, and then
yeah,
maybe I'll pick on Amazon a little bit
yeah. That's
because
good. That's
Amazon
good.
is part of the equation. Like so this goes back to, Ellen, the lifelong reader, feels like
Yeah,
she's lost her love of reading
yeah,
somehow because she can't find any new books that she is into, and she just keeps everything just keeps getting caught in the filter. Like, no, I'm not going to spend 15 hours reading this.
yeah,
It's like, well, like I really this was starting to really get to me.
yeah, yeah,
And like it was starting to really, really get to me. And so I was like, okay, what's going on? So as I started to learn about the pieces of the legacy publishing thing, there was a couple pieces that I noticed that are really um, wild to me. So one of them is that there is a huge bias in the legacy system against short books. And by short, I mean anything under like 60,000 words, which is actually quite a lot.
so give
So
me
if you
give
look
me
at,
a I'm
yeah,
not good at word count, so help me out. Like a
yeah, like
60,000
Thomas
word book
Paine.
is what?
Yeah, it's about 300 pages,
Okay,
about
okay,
300 pages. So if you look at like Common Sense by Thomas Paine, that's like 23,000 words.
okay.
The
And it's a
Tao Te
slim
Ching is like
volume.
10,000 words.
Wait, what was
Yeah,
10,000?
the Tao Te Ching,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and a lot of this stuff and like Art of War and things like some of these like incredible things are like 10,000 words. Thomas Paine's Common Sense is like 23,000 words. There's a lot of novellas and things like Metamorphosis and all that. So the industry is like Kafka's Metamorphosis, I think, is only about like 30,000 words. So you have a lot of
which
stuff
is
that
which is like about 75 pages, right? Heart of Darkness, which I'm
it
just
depends.
finishing
Yeah,
up.
page count is like a function
I
of sort
know,
of
I
how
know.
you
You can
set
totally
things.
fudge it, right? So like Heart of Darkness is 38,000 words. I just looked it up, and you know, and all the various versions that I've come across because I'm teaching it right now online. You're talking about less than 100 pages.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of, like, really great stuff out. I mean, all
Oh,
of Plato's
yeah,
dialogues. I
yeah.
there's so much great stuff out there that has been published that's short, and a lot of times you can get the job done with something short, and the publishers, what they do is they've got these weird internal rules around how they can't price a book at the price point that they want to. They can't charge as much for something that's short, like, because of bureaucracy.
Yeah,
That's just the reason.
yeah.
Um,
Reasons. Yeah, yeah,
like because of reasons, we can't charge, what we wanna charge for a 150-page book, so you have to give us 300 plus pages. And so they contractually obligate every
yeah.
author to produce, like, at least 70,000 words usually as part of the contract. So what ends up happening is, and then even, we've worked on books where we turned in like a tight 180 pages that was like no fluff. We worked with the author. We found everything that was essential. We cut everything that was inessential. We had this beautiful book with this through line that was just absolutely like razor sharp. It was all the information you needed and none of the information you didn't need. And the publisher is like, yeah, we got to add at least 80 pages to this. And they just make stuff up. They just come up with stuff to add. And I've seen it happen like again and again. So I was like, oh, okay, that's why I'll go and pick up a nonfiction book, and 37 pages in, like clockwork, I'll just stop reading it because I can tell that they've gotten through 80% of the substance that is contained in this thing.
Yeah. It's so frustrating, right? I mean, because, you would think that there would be sort of this charity about time and your customer. It's that there's this sense that we have 24 hours in a day, and a certain amount of that are taking up with sleeping, and a certain amount of taking up with work, and a certain time is taken up with your job and meals and whatever. And so why would you make someone wade through 300 pages if you can really say the thing in 175?
Yeah, and we publish all kinds of books. Like this is a book by Brian Gitt called In the Dark, and it's this long. It's 132 pages, and it's 20,000 words because that was the most words I said they could have.
Them's the rules.
But also that was all they needed. And this book makes the case. Essentially, it makes the case for nuclear energy. Without going into too much detail, it's like, um, not so much solar power and wind power, although there are applications for that, but more like nuclear is the future. And here are a bunch of reasons why. And here's my argument. And here's a bunch of supporting data. And we didn't even, if we had printed, there's a bunch of endnotes in this. And if we had printed them, it would have been like 40 pages. So we decided to just make that a QR code that people could just click all the links.
Oh, that's funny. That's funny.
So we often do that because we just think it's fun. And so you have this QR code, and then you can just read the book, and side by side with your phone, you can just click through all of the references, because of course they're all like things that you can find online.
Sure.
Rather than printing URLs at the end of a book. But a legacy publisher, in contrast, like actual, true, honest to God story, is when a friend of mine who's an engineer, he wrote this book, and it was like airtight. And he wrote this very technical book with a technical friend of his who's also an engineer, for a technical press, for a technical audience, a legacy press that was doing like technical books for other software people. That's what the book was for other software people. And they were software people, and they wrote this book, and it was like 150 pages. And the publisher was like, yeah, no, we can't ship this. And so they went back, and they're like, what do we do? And what they did is literally they were like, oh yeah, originally we had this digital resource of code snippets for people to copy and paste into their code while they're doing the software engineering stuff. So we're just going to like put those in the book so people can just have them in the book too. And the publisher was like, great, perfect, ship it, let's go. And so you have 150 pages in that book of stuff that literally is completely and totally useless. Not one person has used that. You go to the digital thing and you copy and paste it into your software.
And this just passes, and so this just passes as just, well, this is just what we have to do. Like it just strikes me as kind of strange, Ellen, that they would be willing to waste our time. Honestly.
And so they have various data on like why they think that books have to be a certain length to also sell, and they're very risk averse, and they want to keep doing what they think works, because the trouble, there's another component of this. The trouble is that their costs, their business model, and everything about the way that their business is structured has created so much cost for the production of every single book that if they don't sell tens of thousands of copies, they lose money.
But you and I both know that there are loads of books that don't even sell 5,000 copies.
Yes.
Big press, big imprint books that basically don't even, I mean, so what are they doing?
Well, they are making up those losses on the shoulders of the couple of authors who sell 500,000.
So is it this kind of one of those like Pareto principle things where the top 20 pays for the bottom 80 or something like that? Or is that the?
Yeah, pretty much. And they sort of allow their business to assume a certain like baseline of sales that's actually like the average that they assume is higher than what a lot of the books are going to sell, so they can sort of justify those mistakes, because they know, well, James Clear's book is going to sell millions of copies, or something that we think is going to be like that. And by the way, that's like, we have so many conversations with publishers and agents and authors, and it's all about like, well, what made that successful? What made that work? And it's like, well, we can look at that from a lot of different angles. There's a lot of causes to a certain effect.
Yeah, of
And
course.
we can look at that from a lot of different angles, and it results in this weird thing where this kind of marketing strategy for the book precedes the book on this monumental level. And one of the
What
things
do you
that
mean by that? To my, because most of my audience, they don't write books or try to publish books. So what do you mean by this?
yeah, so let me try to figure out where the beginning of this is. So
Yeah. Take your time.
it's the publishers never really adapted to the internet. They just sort of collided with it.
Okay.
And so what originally was going on was, you had only a few media formats. You didn't have all these digital media formats that people would read and watch and listen to things in. And so books were kind of like this thing that you would get to get information, and they were one of only a few options for getting information, like also newsletter or newspapers, also radio, also TV. And then the internet changed the game in a bunch of ways that people didn't understand at all. But the publishers still had to survive by moving high volumes of books, even while all sorts of strange things were happening where people were getting their information from all these other sources in all these new ways. And so what they ended up doing is they ended up relying on the internet to become the judge of who should get to publish a book and what people actually wanted. And so what they do now, by and large, is they wait for somebody to develop a really large online following, like so
Like
large.
Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Is this what you're
Twitter,
talking about?
Instagram, email, TikTok now is a big one too.
Right.
Those
Right.
are those are some of the main ones. YouTube as well, like Jordan Peterson famously
Sure.
was more of a
Sure.
YouTube star. And so they wait for somebody to get a really big social media following to the point where they can just play a numbers game. Like if this guy has 2 million followers on YouTube, then it's a safe bet that we can make our money back if we buy 20,000 copies of his book, because it's a safe enough bet that, 1% of his audience will ultimately buy the book. And
And that's all
so
they need is 1% of 2 million to sort of make it work.
exactly, something
Okay. Okay.
something like that is sort of like an oversimplified
Yeah.
version of like
Fine.
what they're
Yeah.
doing.
Yeah.
And so they go, okay, this guy, and so if you look at a modern book proposal now, like an effective book proposal that will get you a nice big advance, with a leading, well-respected press and a great agent at your side who's helping you write this proposal,
Mhm.
what it looks like is, let's say it's about 30 pages long. The first 15 plus pages are all about your online following and who online. Who else is going to like advertise your book when it comes out? Because they need to know, oh, yeah, not only are you going to directly advertise it to your own audience, but you also know this other guy and this other guy and this other guy and this other guy. And they're all going to advertise it to their audience. So you bring them, the first 15 pages is you convincing them that you can sell these books via this kind of digital approach. And the last part of it, they probably hardly even read because that's the content of the book. And they aren't really that concerned with that. They're concerned with moving copies of the book because they have to move a lot of copies in order to stay in business. And because they don't have any other real way of doing business. Like if the author wants to
Yeah.
sell the rights to Netflix or something like that, that's not really anything of the publisher's concern typically, for example. So like
So
that's not an avenue that's open to them.
right. So the business is the business, not necessarily the thing, the problem being solved. It's so interesting to me because I see this pattern replicate itself in a bunch of different directions. So, okay, devil's advocate. So what?
Yeah.
All right, so fine. Jordan Peterson's got 2 million YouTube subs, and he sells a crap ton of books. I mean, what's wrong with the model? I mean, what are you seeing? I mean, I don't get it.
So there are a couple of things that are wrong with the model. Um, One of the things that's wrong with the model, actually, Jordan Peterson is an okay example. Sometimes the model works okay.
Yeah.
Um, One of the things with Jordan Peterson is that there was the 12 Rules for Life book. That was the first
Yep.
major book. He had a
Yeah.
book before that that was more obscure.
Yeah. Maps of
Um,
Meaning. I have it over here.
I
Yeah.
have it too. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's kind of a wild ride.
Yeah.
Um,
Indeed. Indeed.
so he had 12 rules for life, and then they had 12 more rules for life,
Yeah. I have it here
which
too.
which was wholly unnecessary.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was
Agreed.
like just 100% cash grab,
Yeah.
on the publisher's part largely because Jordan is making more of his money from speaking gigs.
Sure.
So what happens is not only the amount, yeah, he's making money off the books, but he's making a lot more money off of the speaking gigs. The book itself, Tiago Forte, the author of Building a Second Brain, actually published a post about this at one point where he was like, yeah, so my advance was like $500,000, but I've spent like $500,000 promoting this book, and I'm not really sure if I made money on this book at the end of the day. And
Wow.
that's totally normal at this point because of the scale distortion that's sort of happening is that
Yeah.
people don't realize that that top line number of like book sales and all that stuff, a lot of that money doesn't go to the author. Yeah, they get a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of good things that happen. Okay, but here's the thing: is Jordan Peterson is an example of somebody who I think it went okay with. There are a
Mm-hmm.
lot of other examples of people who have sold a lot of books, and kind of were sourced in a similar way. But here's what happened with them: is they didn't write their own books,
What?
and so
What are you talking about, Ellen Fishbein? Come on,
and so
I'm a naive dweller in the outskirts, in the outlands. What are you telling me? What is
this
this?
is something that and I this is something that, like, on a personal level, I still am trying to figure out how to understand this
Mhm.
and how exactly I feel about this, but there's something that doesn't sit right about this to me. And what it is that you have a ton of people in that publishing pipeline who check all those boxes of um, they have the huge following and they have the marketing strategy and they manage to assemble an agent and do all this, jump through all these hoops to get this deal and stuff. And it's like, okay, cool, good for them. But then they actually, not only do they not know how to write a book, which is like normal, everybody needs help learning how to write a book. When the time comes to write a book, you need help. You need other people in your life. That's part of why I exist. Um,
Yeah.
but not only do they like need help, they actually don't really have anything of substance to say. They have mostly, this is kind of the dark side of, I was painting a joyful picture of the whole tweet constraint and how it's good for
Yep.
writing and stuff like
Yep.
that. But the dark side of it is that you have some people who are very, very good at that, who actually don't have anything under the surface to share
Mhm.
at all.
Yeah.
And so what ends up happening is there is actually this underclass of thousands of anonymous ghostwriters. This is a true fact.
Like
There's an
real.
underclass in the publishing industry of thousands of mostly anonymous ghostwriters who are mostly under NDA, who are not
Okay.
allowed to even say what their involvement was in most of these projects, who are called in because a business person or a social media marketing person was able to put all these other pieces together in order to secure that book deal, and then found themselves on the hook for a book that they have no ability to write. Not only do they not know the architecture of a book, but they actually don't have any substance with which to build the thing. And so you have literally legions of ghostwriters. Like, these publishers have lists and lists that go on and on. Like, if one says no, they will call the next one, and they'll call the next one, and they'll call the next one, and they'll call the next one. And they will just substitute somebody in who will take less than they deserve to write a book that is meant to sort of like simulate the voice of this other person and sort of fake the whole thing and like make it come together.
You,
Whereas what I would like to see, honestly, what I would like to see,
you're puncturing all of my carefully curated mythologies here. You're killing me, Ellen.
What I would yeah, and this is like why I had to start a publishing company. This
Mm,
is another reason. There are a host of reasons. This is one of them. So what I would like to see is I would like to see the person who actually writes the book, or at least has the expertise that's being
mm.
presented in the book, to be the person whose name is on the book and who gets the deal. That's what I would like to see.
I mean, that sounds amazingly sensible to me. I mean, and for this, you're a radical. I
Yeah, actually, I'm so radical that the publishers really they're starting to not like me because
okay,
I've taken a little bit of I actually feel less adversarial toward them now than I did a couple years ago when I
okay,
still learned this stuff, because
yeah,
I took a very adversarial stance with some of my initial announcing of Altamira Studio and come one, come all, we're gonna take this system down.
yeah, yeah,
I have a little bit of a more nuanced view now, and I actually
mhm,
think Amazon is a big part of the problem now as
yeah,
well. And but there's something that doesn't sit right with me about this underclass of ghostwriters, right? Like, sure, they make it's like, yeah, okay, first world problems. They're making a good living, they're feeding their families, they're doing all this stuff. But we have this whole machine that's supposed to get ideas from like these people to these other people who want the ideas. And then this big bait and switch just happens in the middle. And to me, uh, not only is that sort of like ethically dissonant for me,
mhm,
but also the books are just objectively not as good as if this process was just,
right, right,
compressed into the more simple
right.
version.
Yeah, there's a real cost, in other words, right? And so it's I'm tying this back to what you had said earlier, and you said something to the effect of, I thought something was wrong with me. I kept going to the local Barnes and Noble or whatever, and I'm going through the stacks and I'm looking at books and like nothing is grabbing me. I buy some, I try the first 25, 45, 65 pages, and it's like, eh. And so you were thinking, oh, Ellen, what's wrong with you? You've got brain fry. And so it sounds to me what you're saying is that actually you're correctly reacting to a sub optimal reality.
So, I mean, that's at least the story that I'm telling myself.
Yeah.
And there are so that the packing things full of fluff, targeting things toward this kind of all these various assumptions and status quo things around how long a book has to be in order to sell and what it's got to look like. And you'll even see kind of a convergence on
Oh,
sort of the right cover designs and
absolutely. It's like genres now have color and font markers that indicate that this is an important book, and you want, and I almost think, Ellen, you know, I just took a flight to Chicago and back, right? And you're sort of walking through it. It's almost like there's a certain kind of book that you want to be seen reading in an airport.
maybe, I mean, maybe that's true.
Yeah.
It's yeah, and so there's that. So all these things kind of came together to show me like, wow, this this industry is really, and they don't really, they're very disconnected from readers as well as from things like the book production process itself. So
Mhm.
another component of it is a lot of the publishers, and again, I don't think these people are bad people, but
Sure.
they are definitely not, they don't have they don't really have the way of looking at the world that I have. Like if I actually got offered a couple of really nice jobs at
Yeah.
legacy publishing companies after some of my work with authors started to get recognized. I got offered jobs that would pay me much more than what I'm making
Yeah.
working on this business, and that would be much less stressful on like almost every level,
And
except
status, and status,
and
and
status.
prestige.
And my whole family was like, "What?"
What are you doing? Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And but it was the easiest. I have to tell you this because like it was actually easier for me to say no, and it was
Okay.
faster for me to say no to those offers than anything I've ever done. Like there was
Why? How
no
could you say no to that?
because there is no way to change this stuff from inside of these institutions.
Wow. Wow.
And the only and And if I couldn't change it, then I would just wither and die
Right.
because
You would
it's
wither
just
and die,
not
and
tolerable.
yeah, it would destroy you as a person. Like, it would shrink your soul. I mean, that's what I'm hearing from you, right? In a very real personal way. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so it actually surprised even me. Like there are
Mm,
moments, there are so many times of, I feel like a rookie most of the time, like every
mhm.
day, and I just sort of like try to get the right advice from the right people to like be
Yeah.
less of a rookie every day.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so there were so many things about me that were like, wow, I'm always in a state of like, fighting against these tendencies towards self-doubt and all this stuff. But like that was like that I even shocked myself like
Mm,
completely with that. And it's like, well, yeah, because I can't like what is the point? I mean, I just don't
yeah.
see the point. I couldn't justify it at all because I couldn't see a way to change it at all. And so yeah, and so I sort of at that point that was kind of like a point of no return where I was
Mhm.
like, "Oh, well, you know, I guess I have to like fix this stuff."
Yeah. Right. Right.
And I have incredible
It
people around me, by the way. Like it's not
No, no,
Ellen.
no. I know
Really,
that, Al, but you very consciously are sort of taking yourself out of the blob, right? You're saying, "Look, I can't do anything with the blob, to the blob, for the blob. I've got to take myself out of the blob because there's a deeper value, it seems to me, or a more important value, which is something real happens in and through a good book, like, and
oh,
with a good book."
absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah, and like a
yeah,
great book is an experience. Like you're not
yeah,
the same person after like okay, so so a lot of entrepreneurs really like Atlas Shrugged.
yeah. No, no,
So I literally have to bring this up
I know.
because I just have to. So a lot of entrepreneurs really like Atlas Shrugged. So I read it and by the way, that was a classic example of like a publisher and an author coming together at a time that just wouldn't that I would like to replicate this on the publisher side and try this again with like the new generation version of this. So what happened is
Yeah,
Ayn Rand had already had some success with the Fountainhead.
right.
And she actually knew she had an audience and all this kind of stuff, which was crazy. Everybody thought the Fountainhead would never sell and all this stuff. So
Yeah,
she had some success with the Fountainhead. So she met with I believe it was Bennett Cerf, the founder of Random House at the
yeah,
time, who like how cool would that be? Okay.
yeah,
So
yeah.
she she was like working the whole publishing system and she met with the founder of Random House and she sits down with him and she's like, okay, look, we're gonna publish Atlas Shrugged. I'm not going to accept any editorial suggestions. You're going to publish the manuscript as is. Like the Unabomber.
The balls
Like
on that person. I love it.
like literally like the Unabomber. That was his
Yeah.
ultimatum
Oh,
too,
man,
which is
that's so funny.
hilarious. And so they were like, okay. So they did that and Atlas Shrugged has had a lot of success. Now, I've actually felt many times that if maybe I had been able to be in Bennett's shoes at that time talking to Ayn Rand, I might have been able to make it even better. I actually believe that.
Yeah.
But anyway, too bad, born at the wrong
Yeah,
time.
my similarly heretical viewpoint on that is that I feel the same way about Dostoevsky, whom I adore. I feel the same way about a number of, like, yeah, it's, editors are really important. And if you can say something, it with 10 rather than 20, you should err toward the side of 10. Personally, I know this is heretical, but
Totally. I mean, so
yeah,
anyway, so the story of that, I love, but also it goes back to that point about a book is a powerful experience. You're not the same after. And so I
yeah,
read Atlas Shrugged when I was 19 and I had just incorporated my first LLC. This is my third company. Um, First one, I managed to sell the digital assets for a small amount of money, which I then promptly lost trying to do a fashion company. Never again.
you have a fashion. Oh, that's so funny. A
It
fashion
was
skeleton in your closet, Ellen. This is
a
amazing.
terrible idea.
Yeah,
You should only do business in an area that you yourself are excellent at,
yeah,
and
yeah,
I'm not with the fashion thing.
yeah. No problem.
So, so the So I lost all that money, and then it wasn't a huge amount, but I still lost it all.
Yeah.
And then I went and worked at this startup involved in other media, and then finally founded this third company. So I'm like on this train. But it was my first LLC. I had incorporated my first LLC like 6 weeks ago. I started reading Atlas Shrugged, and I was commuting to college on this train. It was a long train ride, and I read Atlas Shrugged every day on the train, and it really helped me a lot to shape some of my attitudes about the world. And a lot of entrepreneurs find that it's kind of like the injection of hustle porn that they really need.
Yeah, help me out. So,
Difficult times.
I'm sure the audience will not be surprised to know that, Atlas Shrugged is one of those books you bring up with a certain amount of timidity in many, many sophisticated circles, right? It's like, oh, so, what, and of course, I think those sort of sacred things are ridiculous. So, why did Atlas Shrugged sing to you at that moment? Like, what did it open up for you?
Yeah, I've thought about that a lot.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I'm able to bond with other entrepreneurs over Atlas Shrugged immediately. And
Mhm.
I'm also able to bond with non-entrepreneurs about it. I was on a plane one time on a Spirit Airlines flight,
Nice,
Greyhound in
nice.
disguise,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and I was sitting next to a Spirit Airlines pilot, and he was, sitting there, and he was reading on his phone, and I was like, "Hey, what you reading?"
What you reading? What you reading? Yeah, 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 yeah.
And he was reading Atlas Shrugged. And I was like, "I love that book. I'm
Mhm.
totally all about it." He's like, "Really?" And we got into this whole conversation. And so there's a lot of things about it. I mean, one of the things is that my parents are actually Soviet immigrants like Ayn Rand
Got it.
was. And so there's a lot of stuff in
Totally.
there around, what my parents fled from that is portrayed really well in her writing. She really throws that um, into a universe where you can kind of see, like, what if you had people like that who actually took power in
Yeah,
the United States and
yeah.
started to do this Soviet stuff, and you have the People's State of Mexico and like all this crazy stuff that happens. And but there's something really powerful about what she sees in business people, like the fact that, yeah, some business people really suck and are greedy and, just crappy people and all this kind of stuff. But
Yeah, unlike book publishing or unlike, media or unlike, academia or unlike, come on. They're right. But it's so funny that business people seem in a particular way to kind of to get those and yeah, sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
but yeah, I mean, she sees, and she even has like some lines about this, like she talks about how like the sacred fire that burns in the soul of musicians and poets and stuff like that. Something similar is alive in an entrepreneur and in a business person who's trying to build great things and keep the lights on and create jobs and keep competent people employed. And there are these kinds of scenes that happen that I think people in the business world really feel deeply because it's a way of acting that a lot of people don't always understand or even appreciate. Like people in Atlas Shrugged will just like walk into each other's offices and like boss people around, and it's like their love language.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
and
That's funny.
when you are part of a group of people who are really trying to like get stuff done in the way that entrepreneurs are, that is such a breath of fresh air, and it's great to have somebody understand that you are looking for competence and execution and vision, and to set ego aside in
Yeah.
favor of the thing that needs to get done. And there's a lot of values there that are really shared by people who frankly like achieve great things, take great personal risks, do things that are really scary for them, go out on a limb in various ways. And she just kind of nails that
Mm.
positive side where, and she she kind of nails that positive side and kind of shows people like, yeah, I see the good in there's a lot of good in the people who really build the world in these ways.
Yeah, well, there's a kind of beauty and elegance and form to the executed thing. There's a there's a sort of a, and again, I know might be strange language, but there's a kind of liturgy to it. There's a kind of something magical that can occur with a sort of a coordinated effort toward some sort of goal or end. And so to not be able to see the beauty in that is, interestingly enough, an impoverishment of imagination. And perhaps that's something that Rand kind of really is able to capture for her own story, right? I mean, her own biography suggests that there's a reason why she could walk into the random house and be like, you're going to publish this book, and I'm not going to accept any editorial suggestions. I mean, there's a reason for that, right?
Yes, and it's this competence driven kind of way of looking at things, and this way of setting everything aside in terms of like who's actually good at that job
Yep.
and who's going to get it done. So I'm actually curious. I was hoping we could kind of come back to this because when we had our other
Yeah.
conversations, I sort of dropped some things on you that felt kind of like a little revelatory for you, if I'm not mistaken. Like you were like, oh yeah, there was a little like kind of entrepreneurship 101 stuff that we talked through around how business people view different types of transactions and different types of relationships and stuff. And I'm curious if there was anything that you still found yourself noodling on after that conversation, because you had mentioned like you felt like it was kind of therapeutic, and I was
Yeah.
actually dying to know if there was something that you were still thinking about from all that.
Yeah, full disclosure, I've been a so-called W2 guy for virtually my entire life. You know, to the point where I can do my own taxes. So just, um, me and TurboTax are friends. And I I I've gotten to the point where I marvel at the creativity that I see in the entrepreneurial world, and I'm attracted to it, even if I'm a little scared by it, because I simply, it makes me feel kind of dumb, and I don't necessarily like feeling dumb, but it keeps coming back, it keeps circling back to me, almost like in a kind of nagging sort of way, like, yeah, Kale, you need to do this, and I am much older than you, and I am coming to this realization way older in my life, where the sort of, I find myself at the fringes and the sort of the non-overlapping spaces of the kind of normie script, and I'm kind of surprised to find myself there, even though as I look back on my own kind of intellectual journey and my spiritual journey and my personal journey, I look back on things and say, yeah, Kale, you're always sort of outside, looking in and seeing things. And so I sense, I brought up the word sclerosis earlier, and I hope I don't think I'm suffering from sclerosis at the moment. Health is fine right now, but I am concerned about the sort of the health of the institutions that I have been part of for my entire adult life. And I you seem to have no faith from the very beginning that the normie institutional pathway was either not interesting to you, or you seem to have a preternatural sense that it was just a no-go. And honestly, like, you're telling me this story of you as a 19-year-old, girl, sort of having this insight. I mean, this is not something that I had until like 4 or 5 years ago. And I'm going about my business, doing my thing, and looking for, career pathways and certain things that I should do. And, maybe that's because I'm sort of high on a sense of duty, but I'm realizing that that's been a kind of an unequal relationship. That these institutions, you're talking about big publishing, you're talking about big Amazon, you're talking about these big things, they don't care, eh, because they can't care, right? And I think I'm trying to scratch out a space for me that I can, again, it doesn't have to be like Kale, Zelden Inc. I don't necessarily mean it that, although maybe it does. I don't know. I'm trying to sort of scratch out a way that I can be creative in ways that I just did not think were open to me.
I think, by the way, Zeldink would be good.
Zelden Inc. Yeah. All right. I'll take it.
No, but okay, so let me ask you kind of a
Yeah.
follow-up to
Yeah.
that, right?
Please. Yeah.
When you think about, there are great things that institutions enable us to do, and when we can kind of work to, like, even just me having a team
Mhm.
and being able to just rely on them to be there day in and day out is a
Mhm.
huge benefit versus just kind of having to be like a freelance whatever,
Yeah.
right? So their organization is good, or at least can be used for good.
Mhm. Mhm.
But organizations can also create barriers and create friction and all this kind of stuff, right? So when you think about the barriers and the friction that have been created as a result of the organizations that you're thinking about,
Mhm.
what sort of emotionally like gets you the most worked up about that? What is it that you felt like you wish you could have done, or that you were blocked from doing, or what kinds of things?
Mhm. Yeah. No, good question. I think if it comes down to it, I think it becomes increasingly difficult in these sort of larger, too big to fail type institutions. It becomes increasingly difficult to tell the truth as you see it. And I
Yeah.
find that deeply frustrating. And I probably even find it deeply insulting at a sort of like soul level, right? That you can't really tell the truth. And so that's, and I look at somebody like, Jordan Peterson, and, if you look at his, he had a whole professional life until he was 50, basically, or whatever, 55, maybe, and, he was a university professor guy, and did his thing. And I think he taught at Harvard after he got his PhD. And then he went to University of Toronto and he taught his classes and he did his thing. But for whatever reason, the university was no longer a place or a space that could contain him. And so it violently expunged him. It spit him out like an organism would spit out a pathogen, right? And again, I'm not Jordan Peterson, um, but I feel that, and of course it's a bad thing to feel when you're 52 years old, because like, all right, well then what am I supposed to do? Again, I have a very friendly and cordial, wonderful relationship with my school. I'm not complaining about my
Yeah.
school, but there's just something in me that feels like I have not fulfilled my vocation in life by defaulting to a W-2 world or script. And I don't even know what that means, Alan. This is kind of raw for me. I'm feeling a little uncomfortable, but I mean it. I really feel like I have outsourced me. I've outsourced, my gifts. I've outsourced something fundamental and essential, and not like just for me, like not. But I don't know. This sounds so grandiose and cheesy, but like what I'm supposed to do, something like that.
So do you feel like you can recall a time when you really felt like you were finding a new path to something?
Well, I like doing this. I do like the podcast space. You know, but it can you reset? Is there repeat the question? I want to hear it
So
right.
it feels like you're kind of referring to, I've just sort of followed the path that was laid out. I never forged my own path, or I didn't
Yeah,
feel the experience of forging my own path in the grand scheme of things.
yeah. I think that's exactly right.
And
You
so
know,
I wonder, like, are there times when you feel like you have done that, even if it's a microcosm of it.
Okay, yeah,
And you were
sure.
sort of referring to this podcast a little bit.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'm
yeah.
curious. And thank you for being honest.
Hey, why not? Right? Let's get to the underneath, as my branding would have it.
Right.
Look, when I teach, I feel good. And I'm not going to try to dress it up in pretty language. Like, I feel good. Right. So the other day, I was thinking about this phenomenon because the school year's about to start, and so I'm looking forward to it. And there's a great line in the old movie Chariots of Fire, in which Eric Liddell, he's a sprinter, a runner, and he's preparing for the Olympics, and he's a missionary. And there's some drama over whether or not he can compete in the Olympics because either the lead up heats, or the final heat is on Sunday, and he's a Sabbatarian, so he takes the Sabbath like very seriously. And he's talking to his sister, and he's talking about why he does, and he says, God made me fast. He's talking to his sister. It's a beautiful moment. He says, God made me fast, and when I run, I feel his pleasure. And so I was thinking about this the other day, and I even tweeted it the other day, and it popped into my head. And like, when I'm teaching, I feel God's pleasure. And when I'm having conversations like this, like I do, like I feel God's pleasure. And you can interpret that however you want to interpret it, but it's a hard thing to explain beyond that. It's like, I'm doing like the thing that, it doesn't mean that there are many other people who are also similarly disposed and do it. It's not like it's just me and everybody else is. It's not like that. But it's like, when I'm doing this kind of thing, when I'm marshaling all the various things that I've learned over a lifetime of reading and teaching and talking and studying and consuming and all those sorts of things, when you have these moments to make connections with a person or a bunch of people in a kind of way, it's not like, it's funny, because it's like, it's not my pleasure. Like, you could imagine playing, like, when I was a kid, I remember playing Super Mario Brothers like a bajillion times, right? And it's something really satisfying about winning the game, right? I don't, when you play, as fun as playing Super Mario Brothers was back in the day, I wouldn't, looking back on it, say that I felt God's pleasure exactly. Although there were certainly times where I did like a cool move, like, hey, not a lot of people could do what I just did. But right, so like, it's purely pleasurable, like, because teaching is, or talking, like, there's a drain to it, like there's a cost to this. So it's not like cheap, it's not like junk food where you get this sort of the quick rush. Like, it comes at a cost. But yeah, like, when you're doing this kind of work and making these kind of connections and communing with somebody else, that is like, that's the stuff. That's the stuff.
Yeah. So first of all, beautifully said. I love that so much. And it speaks to like the DNA of somebody who has a craft, that they have gotten really, really good at. I want to sort of offer like just a riff on that.
Yeah, yeah.
So my co-founder Bill is actually a former professor. I met him because I was at Fordham University and I was a student, and I realized that institution was going to eject him.
Right.
When I was there, I knew that was going to happen. And so 5 years later, he is a co-founder of my company.
Yeah, like, that's wild, right? And he's the guy who like lined up in the beginning of September and is teaching, lit classes, right?
Yeah, he was teaching analytic philosophy and symbolic logic and philosophy of mind and all this stuff. And he got up in front of a group of like the whole group of 100+ freshmen, and he said something along the lines of like, most academic writing is really bad writing.
Yep.
We're not going to do any of that here. We're going to focus on clarity and all that stuff. And I knew in that that was I believe a couple weeks before I started my first LLC.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I knew in that moment, I knew he wasn't long for that world of academia. I knew that institution was just going to spit him out.
Why, Helen? Why? I'm really intrigued by this, that you had
because I knew that he was too competent and too daring about the things that he was saying.
Yeah.
And that in that particular, especially in a university,
Yeah.
institutions are different. And especially in that university context, I knew that he was both, it was the combination of being too competent and too cavalier about it,
Yeah. 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 Oh,
and
I know that
too
dance.
sticking out your
I
neck
know that dance.
about it. And I knew that that wasn't going to work. And when he was actually in his almost 50, he started working with me.
Yeah.
And he says that he's never looked back. He says he's happy doing the work we're doing. Now, he's still very much the I recently had an experience with a really great executive coach, which is something that starts to happen eventually.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like pretty wild. I had this incredible experience with this executive coach whose book I hope to help publish in the next 9-10 months.
Mhm.
And he is really, really good, like really great executive coaches. They're really good at getting down to what is preventing you from leveling up as the leader and all this
Mm,
kind of stuff.
mm,
And
mm,
we had this incredible conversation, which I was like really vulnerable and really, it was so obvious to him and to me that like my desire to to be better at this thing that I'm doing was
mhm.
much greater than my ego in that moment. And so we were able to have
Wow.
this great conversation where I was able just to clear away all this stuff. And I realized that there were ways in which I had even within the tiny company that I have, like there were ways in which I had been getting in the way of my co-founder Bill doing what he does best. And what you're describing, like these moments of like almost like an ecstatic level of like being in
Yeah.
the flow state
Yeah.
and like doing what you do best and producing your greatest work and all this kind of stuff. And even though like I have these incredibly pure motives around enabling him to do that as much as possible, there were still ways in which I was constraining him unintentionally
Mm,
with things like emotional decision making and not, you know, being not being forthright about things in various ways and like just personal emotional barriers I had.
yeah.
And like that made me, I had a flash of like extreme guilt
Oh, wow. Wow.
where I was like, "Oh no." And then I just kind of moved past that very quickly because I could see what it was going to take to start to just move on to the next thing. And actually ever since that, which was a few weeks ago, Bill and I have had a different and much better dynamic where
Wow.
like one of the reasons why I brought him on board was that I didn't want to have to pay him by the hour to give me incredible feedback on my own writing.
Mhm, mhm,
I
mhm.
was like, I want to have like unlimited season pass
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
for
Yeah.
this guy's incredible feedback. And so, we had this great moment where, um, I wrote something and I got a lot of feedback from him that was the kind of feedback that we give other people versus the kind
Yeah.
of feedback we give each other is a
Different
little
feel.
different. Like
Yeah.
with other people, it's very much like, well, this thing, and we don't sugarcoat, but we're also like very careful with the way we say things. When we talk to each other, it's like, Ellen, nobody gives a shit about these 8 paragraphs that you
That's right.
have in here. Like,
That's
you
right.
know,
Right.
like, but I took that feedback and I rewrote the thing and I sent it back to him and he was like, "Ellen, you totally crushed this. This is great."
Mhm.
And I was like, "Yes." And we had this dynamic where, we rebalanced our relationship in ways where he didn't feel, and it's a constantly evolving thing, but it's like there's always going to be constraints that end up being put on you. And the hope of somebody who's leading a team is I think if you're a good person, which I think most of us are, the hope if you're leading a team is that you're out of your people's way as much as
Mhm.
possible,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And so my my hope for institutions in general and for people who are inside of institutions is that they manage to kind of find ways to clear out all that crap that's causing the people in charge to be in their way, because if they realize they're in your way, hopefully they realize that's not where they want to be, or maybe you work
Yeah.
with people who find a way to like get out of your way and stuff like that. But it's frustrating because sometimes layers and layers and layers and layers of how things are being done and bureaucracy and proper behaviors that are expected and, you know, fears that people have, and sometimes the people at the top of the organization can't get past their fear of whatever will come if they allow their people to really be unconstrained. I know that's not exactly a solution to what you expressed, but
Well,
it's a perspective.
no, but what's interesting, what you, it's so fascinating, because you're coming at it from a different industry, and even though it's parallel, I suppose, is that you seem to know, though, again, and part of it's the sort of the specter of big publishing, but also it's the specter of Amazon, all of these sort of perverse incentives that are have nothing to do with the essence of the endeavor. You seem to have sensed that, yeah, if anything's to come, you have to sort of create parallel institutions. You have to operate at a scale, that at least for the foreseeable future preserves the integrity of the thing. And you seem to, like, you said, the apple was dangled in front of you not once but twice in terms of, legacy institutions, and you just said no. Like, to me, like, that's a stunning, like, it's brave. Like, I find that brave, actually.
I appreciate that. Perhaps brave, perhaps extraordinarily foolish.
Mhm.
I will tell,
It looks very similar sometimes, right? I mean, it looks remarkably similar.
I think here's kind of my I guess this is sort of my thought on your end is like
Mhm.
if you there was a time when I was like, if I could just get people to pay attention to Shakespeare,
Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
then that would be like great. That would be a job well done, right?
Mhm.
So outside of so for you within kind of the knowledge that you've gained, the passions that you've pursued, like the interests that you've pursued and all that kind of stuff, like
Mhm.
if like what outside of maybe like the sublime, which I feel like is not exactly an answer to the question, but like within the world, if you could sort of turn people's eyes towards something, if you could sort of like make your teaching and your speaking and all your stuff like in service of something like that, what do you think it would be? Like what idea or what
Mhm.
people or what person
Yeah.
or
Yeah, I mean, wisdom, old books, um, and not as a kind of affectation, not as a sort of, oh, I'm gonna dress up in tweed and smoke a pipe and sort of pretend like it's 1832 or something. No, but rather, that there's that wisdom is, look, everybody's going to run a script. All of us are going to run some sort of script, right? And so you can't escape a script. And so it seems to me really important that we have a responsibility to make sure that wisdom is part of the script that we're going to run in our lives. And I look around me, I look at the young people that I teach, I look at the adults, the parents who come and talk to me, and I know clearly, unequivocally, that they are hungry for wisdom. And again, not in any kind of sort of overtly political platform. It's not that it's sort of it's all that sort of stuff, but I think people are longing for something that is not fast fashion, something that is not ephemeral, something that is not quick and gone, a flash in the pan, popular. I think people are, I believe that there's a sort of a hunger for it, but there's, I would say, even beyond that, there's a need for it that is being that has been has been underserved for the better part of 75 years, let's call it, but certainly 50. And and I know that people will accuse me of being some sort of like a right-wing reactionary, like, fine, whatever. I don't, or, oh, I only want to do this for political reasons. But no, I really think, for instance, to go back to our mutual love of Shakespeare, I genuinely believe that to be a better human being in some real way, we have to have our imagination stretched and populated and animated by, I don't know, Hamlet, or Othello or Romeo and Juliet. And absent that, you are living an impoverished script that could lead to, enemy.
So you want to know what I think?
Yeah, yeah, of course. That's why I have you on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that that's great. It's beautiful. It's awesome. It's like totally 100% there's a hunger for it. And we need a lot of cooks on that line.
Yeah. 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 Right. Right. Right.
and 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 I think that and I really think that you can absolutely 100% still do that. Um, whether or not, or to whatever extent you choose to pursue what I see as the craft of entrepreneurship, kind of like a lot of other crafts.
Yeah.
Um, whether or not you choose to pursue that, or to whatever extent you choose to pursue that, I think you can absolutely still do that and still have your life ultimately be like in service of that. I really believe that.
Mhm.
To that end, I told you I would do this, and I have to send you this.
Yes,
You're gonna
please.
love this. Ask
Yeah.
Aristotle is so much fun.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that is a conversation that is worth continuing, and that's a goal that's worth achieving. And whatever good things are in your life now, I think can be in service of that, you know?
Yeah, and they have to be, right? I mean, there's it's funny because like on the one hand, I can say, oh, I'm 50 years old. But it's like still got a lot of time, there's time. I have time here left, right? It's not like the thing is done, but it does require you to step out of a comfort zone. Let me rephrase this. It will require me to step out of a comfort zone that I used to think served me, and now I feel like it enervates me, and that thing, and so therefore I am attracted to entrepreneurial space or the entrepreneurial community, however you want to sort of phrase this, because I see the creativity in it that perhaps I didn't see when I was a snotty 20-year-old.
Super interesting. Yeah. I mean, I love it. There's definitely a lot of creativity in it, and there's a lot of constraint.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a lot of there are these constraints that you only discover. The rules are not really made that clear at the outset.
Right.
That Peter Thiel book helps a little bit, but
Mhm.
um, yeah, you kind of only learn the rules while playing the game.
Yeah, and I remember the part it right, and look, this brings it back to the sonnet, right? I mean, I think this
Yeah.
really brings back, your intuitive attraction to the sonnet seems to be multi-layered, and there's real depth to that, at least on an intuitive level. When you were younger, and now as an older person, you can see it. But the part that really hit me in reading the 0 to 1 book is the story that he tells about not getting the clerkship with the Supreme Court justice, and that really hit me in a good way. But I was like, wow, like this is Peter Thiel. Like Peter Thiel's like one of the tech titans of Silicon Valley, and it's still, you could tell because it's still kind of like smarted that he didn't get it, kind of, but there was also this sort of real recognition that, but if I had done that, I would have just been a lawyer, a good lawyer, no doubt. He's a brilliant guy, would have been a great lawyer, but not the what he has done, what he has created in his life. And so I have my own versions of that I won't bore the audience with, but that really helped me say, okay, maybe those things that I have interpreted as losses, maybe those things that I've interpreted as hits, those things that I've interpreted as blows to my ego, are actually these things that are maybe saving me for something else. And you could tell, like with Peter Thiel, the way he tells that story in the book, he thought he really, really wanted it, right? And of course, he's all into the Rene Girard stuff and the mimetic desire, but he seemed to suggest that even at that level of sophistication, what he thought he wanted ultimately wasn't what he wanted. And so I'm trying to use that as I don't know, as a kind of a lesson, you know. So we'll see.
I love that story,
Yeah.
and it's totally true. It's like these things that you think you want, and these dream jobs that you think are your dream jobs, and all this stuff, and these doors that you think you want to go through, like when they close,
Yeah.
sometimes that's the time when something
Yeah.
really great happens.
Yeah. And so I'm trying to see that and make something out of that, right? Not just, it's not just a pretty thought, right? I know that, thoughts come and go. But to realize, to make incarnate something is sort of the next step. So Ellen, I could talk to you forever. This is like our second time doing this, and I swear every time I'm like, man, I could like really keep going here. But I should bring this to a close. I want to thank you for coming on the show here and sharing your expertise and noodling around with your love of entrepreneurship and poetry. It's something that I'm trying to sort of sort out and figure out myself. Where can people find you, and maybe even solicit your services? I mean, where can they go?
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Mhm.
This was great. We
Mhm.
have to do this again.
Yeah.
I am on X as Ellen Rhymes,
Hmm.
and writing.coach is a good place to find me as well.
Good one. That's a good one. That's a good one. All right. Well, thank you so much. This has been great. More to come.